Hey YouTube, today I'm going to show you guys how I went about making this brick pattern cutting board. Stick with me till the end and let me know what you think. Let's get busy. Let's start this project by cutting some 8/4 walnut and some 8/4 maple down into 24-inch strips that I'll then rip into 2-inch strips for the walnut and 1/4-inch strips for the maple. After swapping in a ripping blade, I'm going to adjust the saw to the gullet thickness of the blade to the top of the walnut, and then I'm going to set the fence at 2 inches in width so we can rip our walnut strips. In total, I'm going to rip a total of 7 2-inch walnut strips. Of the walnut strips that I cut, I'm going to take the last one, the 7th one, and rip it in half to 1 inch. This will ensure that we have a good brick pattern later on in the cutting board design. Next, I'm going to use my thin rip jig and rip the maple at 1/4 inch in width. This is with the face grain, as we did with the walnut strips. In total, I'll also rip 7 maple strips. Now we'll lay our walnut strips out on end, and we'll place a maple strip in between the walnuts. I start with the 1 inch ripped strip at one end, and then we'll lay the 2 inch followed by the 1/4 inch maple strip in between. And you'll see that we'll have the beginnings of our brick pattern emerging on the end grain side, which is the goal. Now we're ready for our first glue up. Onto our first glue up, we're going to get our board glued up with walnut and then maple strips in between each piece of the walnut, and we'll clamp it down to make sure everything's nice and tight. Now let's get the board out of the clamps, and then we'll move on to the drum sander to get her sanded down flat on both sides. I run the board through the drum sander on both sides multiple times to knock the last of the glue remnants off of the board, and also to get it flat, because our next step is going to be to cross cut all of this and start forming it into our brick cutting board. I'll start off by squaring up the ends of the board, and then I'm going to start cutting strips that are 1.5 inches thick. And these are going to make up the brick part of the brick cutting board. I want to point out, for the sake of safety, that in between each of these cuts I am turning off the saw before reaching over by the blade. Because I speed up the process of the film, I don't want anyone to think that I'm reaching into a live blade. Now that we've got our strips cut, I'm going to alternate the direction of every other piece so that we're offset a little bit. Before we can do the glue up, there's one more step that I need to do, and that's to cut end grain strips to go in between each piece of this board. The reason I do end grain is because I want to make sure that we're not mixing face with end grain, so that we don't have any problems with the board later on down the road. Once again, I'm going to use the thin rip jig, but this time, instead of ripping, I'm actually cutting across the grain and making, or the face grain is facing upward, and I'm cutting and making 1/4 inch strips that are face grain. These are going to separate our other pieces in the board. Now I'm going to run everything through the drum sander one more time to make sure we have flat surfaces for all of our glue ups. So on the face grain side of the main board pieces, I'm running those through to flatten and make sure that they're nice and smooth. And we'll do that on both sides of each piece of the board. And then I'll move on and do the same with the maple end grain strips that are 1/4 inch wide. We'll make sure that the face side of those is nice and even so that we get a good glue up. Now for our final glue up, I'm going to get all the pieces laid out in the order that I want them, and we'll get the alternating pieces flipped over and put maple strips in between before we glue. During the glue up, we want to try to align our pieces the best we can before we finally clamp everything down. This will minimize waste at the end and keep the uniformity of the board. Now that we've given the board about 24 hours to dry, let's go ahead and remove the clamps and start getting our excess glue sanded off with the drum sander. I use the chisel to get as many of the big globs off and to get all the smaller parts off on the back. Now we'll run the board through the drum sander to remove all the excess glue on both sides and make ourselves a flat board. Next stop is back to the table saw, where we can square up the board on all four sides. Now comes the part that we all love to hate, and that is the sanding. So I'm going to kick this off with 60 grit, work my way up to 80, 120, 150, 180, and then finish off with 220. And then we will raise the grain and then hit it again with 220. One of the most satisfying parts of the entire process, and this is where we raise the grain. We'll spray this down with just a little bit of water to get the grain to come up, and then we will hit it with 220 again. And of course we raise the grain to make sure that the first time the board gets wet after it's finished, that it doesn't feel like it's unfinished and unsanded. So we raise the grain with water, sand it back down with the same level of sandpaper, and then we can finish out the processing of the board and leave us in a condition to where when we complete the board, it will remain smooth even after being exposed to water. Now that we've raised the grain, we'll go ahead and sand one last time with 220 grit. This will knock down the little edges that came up as we raised the grain and give us a nice smooth surface. Now a quick dust off with the air compressor to remove any of the fine surface dust that may be left over, and then we will laser our brand into it. The most satisfying part of any one of my builds is where we get to the end and we start applying the mineral oil finish. I just love how the color comes to life with the project. Now it's time to apply some of my homemade board butter to finish off the project. I'm going to apply it with a piece of 3M Scotch-Brite to really work it into the grain. I use the Scotch-Brite pad to really work the wax into the pores in the grain of the wood. This is so that when it hardens up after application, it'll fill those pores in grains and give us a nice, smooth, almost glass-like surface. After about 30 minutes, I'll come back and start wiping down the board to remove the excess board butter. I do this with a terry cloth towel so that I can not mar the surface up too terribly much. I finished the project by installing the rubber feet on all four corners of the board. These next couple of shots are just to give you a close-up view of the grain patterns in the end grain board. Thanks everyone for watching. Hope to see you all again soon. Please take the moment to like and subscribe to the channel, and here's a few more videos that I think you might like.